We all know the story of World War II as a war of steel, a global conflict defined by the clash of titans like the German Bismarck and the American Sherman tank. It was a war won by industrial might, by nations that could churn out an endless river of metal, turning raw ore into the machinery of destruction. The narrative is one of tanks, battleships, and bombers, a symphony of rivets and welded plates. But what if that's only part of the story? What if, hidden in the margins of history, there's another narrative? A story where the tide of war was almost turned not by steel, but by wood. It sounds almost primitive, a step backward in an age of technological leaps. But this wasn't just any wood. This was wood transformed, reimagined, and pushed to its absolute limits. This is the story of three radical transformations, a trilogy of timber that reveals a hidden chapter of human ingenuity. It's a journey that stretches from a frozen secret weapon dreamed up in the darkest days of the war, to the sun-scorched railroads that conquered the American desert, and finally, right into the advanced materials labs of tomorrow, where the legacy of these ideas is being reborn. Our first act begins in a most unlikely place, a refrigerated meat locker deep beneath the streets of London, hidden below the Smithfield Meat Market. This wasn't a laboratory or a military base. It was a cold, damp, and frankly macabre setting for one of the war's most audacious projects. In 1942, amidst the carcasses of hanging animals, a team of scientists and commandos worked in absolute secrecy. The group was known as the Combined Operations Experimental Establishment, a collection of brilliant, eccentric minds tasked with developing unconventional weapons. Their work here was so clandestine, it was hidden in plain sight, shrouded by the mundane reality of the city's food supply. Their mission? To reinvent ice. They weren't mad. They were following the wild idea of a man named Geoffrey Pyke, a genius inventor and advisor to the War Cabinet. Pyke recognized a critical problem. The Allies were losing the Battle of the Atlantic. German U-boats were sinking supply ships faster than they could be built, and conventional aircraft carriers were too scarce and valuable to risk in the mid-Atlantic gap. Pyke's solution was radical: build an unsinkable, indestructible aircraft carrier out of ice. But not just any ice. Pure ice is surprisingly weak and brittle. Pyke's innovation, developed with his team in that meat locker, was to reinforce it with wood pulp, essentially sawdust or old newspapers. They called it Pykrete in his honor. The results were astonishing. Ordinary ice was brittle, useless against any kind of force. But mix in just 14% wood pulp by weight, freeze it, and you got something that could stop a .303 bullet in its tracks. The wood fibers acted like rebar in concrete, arresting cracks and distributing the force of an impact. It had the strength of concrete but floated on water. It was slow to melt, self-healing to a degree, and could be machined like wood. It was a miracle material. The project, codenamed Habakkuk, after a biblical passage about an unbelievable work, was so promising it reached the very top. Lord Mountbatten, the chief of combined operations and the project's champion, was utterly convinced of its potential. Legend has it that he once burst in on Winston Churchill during a bath to demonstrate a chunk of Pykrete, dropping it into the hot water to show how slowly it melted. Another more dramatic story claims he brought 2 blocks, one of normal ice, one of Pykrete, to a high-level meeting of Allied commanders. He shot the ice block, and it shattered. He then fired his pistol at the Pykrete block to demonstrate its resilience. The bullet ricocheted, grazing the uniform of U.S. Fleet Admiral Ernest King and narrowly missing a senior U.S. admiral before embedding itself in the wall. The point, though nearly fatal, was made. The vision was staggering. A 2,000-foot-long carrier, twice the length of any warship at the time, with a hull 40 feet thick. It would be a floating airbase, a man-made iceberg immune to torpedoes, which would either bounce off or create a small crater that could be easily patched with more ice. It would carry 200 aircraft and be constructed in the shipyards of Canada, using the abundant timber and freezing temperatures. But Pykrete had a fatal flaw, one that couldn't be overcome. It needed constant refrigeration. While it melted slowly, it also had a property called plastic flow. It needed to be kept at a steady 15 degrees Celsius, or it would slowly sag and deform under its own colossal weight. The sheer amount of steel and complex machinery needed for the refrigeration plant was enormous, undermining the very premise of a cheap, steel-free vessel. As the war shifted, with Portugal granting the Allies access to air bases in the Azores and new long-range aircraft closing the Atlantic Gap, the gargantuan effort needed for Habakkuk was deemed unnecessary. A prototype built in Canada proved the concept, but also the immense engineering challenges. The glacier ship was left to melt, both in Patricia Lake, where its icy remains took over a year to disappear, and in the classified files of the military. While Pykrete was a brilliant, localized invention born of wartime desperation, our second transformation was a quiet, industrial workhorse that conquered an entire continent. The question shifted from the battlefield to the frontier. If wood could be made strong enough to stop bullets, could it be made durable enough to conquer the Mojave Desert? At the turn of the 20th century, railroad tycoons dreamed of connecting Salt Lake City to the burgeoning port of Los Angeles. The most direct path went straight through the Mojave, the hottest, driest landscape in the United States. For a railroad, this was a death sentence. The intense heat, flash floods, and voracious termites meant that traditional wood ties would warp, rot, and be eaten to dust in a matter of years, making the line impossibly expensive to maintain. The solution wasn't a physical mixture like Pykrete, but a deep chemical transformation. The answer was a foul-smelling, black, oily substance derived from coal, creosote. Using a method called the Bethel process, railroad ties made from softwoods like pine were loaded into massive, pressurized cylinders. First, a vacuum would suck the air and moisture from the wood's cellular structure. Then, hot creosote was flooded in under immense pressure, driving the oily preservative deep into the wood's cells. It was like turning pine into a petrified, toxic fossil. This treatment made the wood impervious to water, rot, and insects. Creosote-treated ties could last 40 to 50 years, even in the most extreme conditions imaginable. This wasn't just about building a railroad. It was about creating permanent, resilient infrastructure in impossible places. It allowed the steel rails to stitch the country together across hostile terrain. And in the middle of that brutal desert, the railroad needed a place to service its steam engines. That critical water stop, a small oasis in the vast emptiness, they called it Las Vegas. The treated wood that built the railroad literally laid the foundation for the city you know today. And back in the war, this idea of transformed wood was everywhere, even if it was less exotic than Pykrete. The famed British de Havilland mosquito, the wooden wonder, was a fast, agile bomber made of plywood and balsa wood, bonded with new synthetic glues. Its wooden construction made it light, fast, and nearly invisible to German radar. In fact, during World War II, the U.S. military used a greater tonnage of wood than of steel for everything from barracks and gun stocks to countless supply crates and even ships like the PT boat. Wood was not a secondary material. It was a primary strategic asset. Forests became a critical resource, with the government launching a timber production war project to squeeze every possible board foot from the nation's timberlands. Lumberjacks were granted draft deferments, recognized as essential workers on the home front, their axes and saws as vital as any rivet gun in a shipyard. Which brings us to our final transformation, the legacy of these wartime innovations. The dream of making wood stronger, lighter, and more versatile didn't end in 1945. It went dormant, then it evolved. Today, in labs around the world, scientists are performing what can only be called molecular alchemy on wood, creating materials that Geoffrey Pyke could only have dreamed of. They start by chemically treating wood to remove lignin, the natural polymer that makes it rigid. Then they use heat and massive pressure to compress it, collapsing its natural channels and forcing the strong cellulose fibers into an ultra-dense pack. The result is a new class of material, sometimes called densified wood or superwood. It can be stronger than most titanium alloys, yet at 1/6 the weight of steel. It can be made transparent, molded into complex shapes, and is naturally fire-resistant. This isn't a lab curiosity. Companies and governments are investing hundreds of millions of dollars into factories that can turn cheap, fast-growing, and waste wood into these high-performance materials. They're being developed for everything from bullet-resistant panels that are lighter than Kevlar to the structural skeletons of skyscrapers, a concept known as mass timber construction. So, look at this trilogy of timber. It's a single thread of innovation woven through a century of history. From the secret, frozen hope of Pykrete, a desperate gamble made of ice and sawdust, to the greasy, persistent grit of creosote-treated timber that built empires in the sand and tamed a continent, and finally to the atomic-age precision of superwood, born from the same fundamental idea that wood is not an end product, but a platform for incredible transformation. It's a story that reframes our entire view of a material we so often take for granted. Wood wasn't just a passive resource in the greatest conflict in history, nor just a building block for the century that followed. It was a canvas for some of the most radical, desperate, and brilliant engineering the world has ever seen. It was a secret weapon, a nation builder, and now, a key to a more sustainable future. And that transformation is still being written.